Thank you, Madam Speaker. I am very grateful to rise today in support of Senate Bill 762. 2020 was not the first year my community experienced the impacts of wildfire. In 2018, we suffered through 6 weeks of choking smoke. That was our first sustained experiences with those N95 masks. We are an economy that depends on the summer season, and the smoke prompted existential questions about the survival of the community. At the end of that summer, I held a smoke and fire summit, and 400 residents showed up to spend a Saturday morning talking about what to do, how to mitigate the consequences of severe wildfires on our economy, health, and quality of life. To be sure, our Southern Oregon communities are strong and resilient. We've come together to understand the multiple issues involved in smoke and fire and to identify pragmatic steps to recover and then to keep our community safe. But we cannot do that alone. We need the state of Oregon to fund smart investments that will help us confront the fires we know are coming. Senate Bill 762 provides a broad response to the extraordinary threat and concrete reality of wildfire in my community and across the state. It does so by, first, providing the resources and oversight needed for wildfire prevention and response. Second, systematically identifying and mapping areas of significant risk. And third, employing mitigation strategies to keep structures more resistant to disaster. Each one of these critical functions will be guided by public input, gathered through rulemaking, consultation with boards and commissions, stakeholder participation, and oversight by the newly formed Wildfire Programs Advisory Council. The first step in our wildfire response is to build our prevention and response capabilities. Accordingly, Senate Bill 762 provides a comprehensive approach to these functions. Among other elements, the bill requires the Public Utility Commission to work with utilities to adopt best practices and ensure that they have wildfire mitigation plans in place. It provides resources to protect vulnerable communities from wildfire smoke. It invests in community-driven restoration of forests and rangelands to reduce risk, protect lives and property, and increase landscape resiliency. It establishes a new youth and workforce training program to reduce wildfire risk and to provide workforce training to the next generation of land managers. It funds a system of cameras to provide an eye on the land and ensure that fires are identified at the earliest possible point. It establishes a small forest grant program to help landowners fund forest resilience efforts. And it creates a burn manager program to create increased expertise and application of prescribed burns as a preventive strategy. Senate Bill 762 also grants additional suppression resources to the Department of Forestry and the State Fire Marshal, adding firefighter capacity and air defense resources to provide improved wildfire response and ensure firefighter safety. Along with the bill's broad prevention strategies, we need to understand the specific landscapes most at risk of wildfire. Accordingly, SB 762 requires the Oregon Department of Forestry to oversee the development of a comprehensive map that will assign properties to one of 5 statewide risk categories: extreme, high, moderate, low, or no risk. These risk classifications will reflect specific conditions on the ground, including weather, climate, topography, and vegetation, although required rulemaking will undoubtedly produce a spirited discussion of the criteria to be used. ODF will oversee and fill in the map by assigning properties, and Oregon State University will be responsible for the technical elements of the map. The map will also contain the boundaries of the Wildland-Urban Interface, or WUI, which will be defined in a rulemaking conducted by the Department of Forestry. This process will be transparent and accessible. Property owners and local governments will have an opportunity to provide input into the classification of specific properties, and they will also have access to an appeals process. Properties that are mapped as extreme or high risk and that fall within the boundaries of the WUI will be subject to defensible space standards developed by the State Fire Marshal. The intention here is simple: to make sure that landscapes have been cleared or treated in a way to slow or mitigate wildfire, and to provide adequate space around residences for firefighters to do their work. The Fire Marshal will use the International WUI Code as a starting point and consider input from multiple sources, including the Oregon Fire Code Advisory Board, Oregon Best Practices, local governments, and participants in rulemaking. Enforcement of the defensible space standards will be conducted by the Fire Marshal, but local governments may choose to take on that function and can adopt defensible space standards that exceed those set by the fire marshal. And because education should always be paramount, SB 762 directs the fire marshal to administer a community education program to help landowners understand best practices. New buildings and residential accessory buildings located in extreme and high-risk areas and within the WUI will be subject to building code standards developed to provide additional fire resistance. This is a residential standard, so commercial buildings and farm structures will be unaffected. The aim here is simply to ensure that residents in extreme or high-risk locations are just a little safer when wildfire comes their way. Wildfire considerations, including mapping and other appropriate risk strategies, will be incorporated into the statewide land use planning program by the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Madam Speaker, a program of this size and complexity will need extensive input and ongoing direction. Accordingly, the bill requires stakeholder engagement and input from public boards and advisory committees in the development and review of the statewide wildfire map, defensible space standards, building codes, and land use recommendations. Long-term, a new state wildfire programs director will oversee the program. A 19-member wildfire program advisory council composed of local governments, fire chiefs, fire marshals, property owners, farmers, ranchers, tribes, utilities, environmental interests, and others will advise the state wildfire programs director, monitor and provide recommendations for program implementation, and engage with communities. For those who worry about a cookie-cutter approach, it is significant to note that the bill specifically requires the council to ensure that building codes and land use decisions are applied in a regionally appropriate manner. The bill also calls out the council's obligation to assess the application of defensible space standards to vineyards, crops, and other cultivated vegetation. Madam Speaker, as of yesterday, Oregon Department of Forestry reported that the state has experienced 597 fires, burning about 15,000 acres at this point. This is twice as many fires and roughly 4 times as many acres as is normal at this time of year. Costs to the state in fighting wildfire have increased from an average of $10 million back in 2013 to more than $70 million annually. Last year, we lost 4,000 homes and fires burned 1 million acres of forest. That data tells the story. We cannot wait, we must act. I urge an aye vote on Senate Bill 762.
And Representative Marsh, would you like to close?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just a few comments. I want to respond to a few things that were said on the floor. The first is the question of crops and how farmland might be affected. I want to reiterate that the focus of defensible space is really residential structures, and it's simply to make sure that those residential structures have appropriate landscaping around them and that there is room for firefighters. There is every reason to believe that crops and agricultural practices will be unaffected except as they interact with residential structures. But at any rate, I want to recall my statement in the initial comments that notes that the council is specifically empowered within the legislation to look at the application of defensible space to vineyards, crops, and cultivated vegetation. And the state fire marshal has indicated to me her preference to have that happen before rulemaking ever proceeds so that the issues will be decided and put to rest. As Rep. Owens described, there's certainly been a lot of discussion in this building around how to define the wildland-urban interface. And like him, I am confident that the language that we arrived at is going to work. But ultimately, frankly, what will make the bill effective in the long term is adoption of rules that accomplish the goal of the legislation. And to be clear, the intent here is to utilize nationally recognized best practices and standards so we can successfully prepare for, mitigate, and respond to wildfire and have the very best chance to prioritize areas where action is required to keep communities safe. And that will start with that definition of the WUI. The bill directs the State Board of Forestry to consider national best practices when defining the WUI in rule and developing the criteria that will identify and classify it, as well as specific regional differences. One other clarification. To be clear, the intent of the bill language is to establish 5 statewide wildfire risk classes, not 5 WUI classes. Within the WUI boundary, wildfire risk classes will be established for all parcels, and wildfire risk classes will also be established for all parcels outside the WUI, statewide. Regarding the wildfire risk classes, Section 7, subsection 4 states, in consultation with Oregon State University, the department shall establish 5 statewide wildfire risk classes of extreme, high, moderate, low, and no risk. The map must be based on the wildfire risk classes, be sufficiently detailed to allow the assessment of wildfire risk at the property ownership level, and include the boundaries of the wildland-urban interface. Finally, Madam Speaker, I want to close today with the story of Ruby Reed. Ruby is the owner of Valhalla Organics, and she makes and she markets the most killer pickles you have ever eaten, and luscious honey and veggies that are pickled. In September 2020, Ruby and her husband, Chris, lost everything in the Alameda fire. They lost their home, they lost their car, they lost their inventory, they lost their equipment. But they were grateful they survived, and they're quite resilient people. And so they moved from Talent, Oregon to Klamath Falls, where they would be closer to their farm, which was located in the Klamath Mountains. That was the home to all of Ruby's bees and her beehives. They regrouped. Ruby found a new kitchen. She started producing, again, those fabulous pickles. I'm in her pickle club, so I get quarterly deliveries. So they were okay, and their bees were okay, and they started to rebuild. And that optimism lasted until last weekend, when their farm, crops, and all of Ruby's hives were destroyed in the June 2021 Crosscut fire. So now Ruby is selling all of her inventory, and she and Chris are moving away. Oregon just is not a place where they can ever feel comfortable again. There's actually a fundraiser for her happening right now at the Cheese Cave in Phoenix, where they're selling off their inventory, because Ruby needs support to start over in a new place. The presence and threat of wildfire will determine the viability of my community and of many others across the state. We must act. I urge an aye vote on Senate Bill 762.